Perfectionism is killing your progress, and here's why. There's an endless amount of calisthenics tutorials out there, and they usually do and say the same thing. You'll unlock a hard exercise if you follow a list of progressions provided, usually a list of 1 to 10, 1 being the easiest, 10 being the hardest. And so you would start with progression 1 until you master it, and then you move on to progression 2 until you master it, and then you keep doing that for each individual progression, trying to master each individual progression. But there are 2 problems with that. Problem number 1 is efficiency. When we do an exercise to mastery, we become very efficient at it and we no longer waste energy while doing it. That sounds great, but we only want efficiency when it comes to everyday life. We don't want to waste energy throughout the day. And if you're in manual labor, for example, we don't want to waste unnecessary energy because you have to do it again tomorrow and the next day. And if you're in sports, you want to be as efficient as possible so that your opponents get tired first. For example, in martial arts, if your opponent gets tired first, you can capitalize on that. So you want to save as much energy as possible. In strength training, however, we actually want to do the opposite. We want to be as inefficient as possible because that allows us to waste more energy, and that allows us to become stronger because our body is adapting to that stressor that we've placed on it. This is probably the biggest confusion in calisthenics, is understanding the difference between a strength exercise and a skill. A strength exercise will help you become stronger for a skill by using more energy when pushing against resistance. A pike push-up, for example, pushes against your own body weight and gravity and helps you become stronger, and you're using energy to do that. On the other hand, a handstand is a skill, and you're trying to use as little energy as possible when doing a handstand. No one is using a handstand to get stronger. That's not the goal of the handstand. The goal of the handstand is to balance. Problem number 2 is that we're all made differently. We have different strengths and limitations. We have different training backgrounds. We have different genetics, which would include body composition, which would include limb length, which is a huge deal in calisthenics. So how can one video tutorial suit everyone in the whole world? And the answer is it can't. It's impossible. Let's take a look at one of my clients, Richard, and how he unlocked his tuck planche push-up. Before we started working together, Richard had a very good pseudo planche push-up, but he wasn't yet able to do a full tuck planche push-up. So under the master each progression philosophy, we would continue doing pseudo planche push-ups until he was able to do a tuck planche push-up, which would mean adding more reps or adding more sets or doing it with a weighted vest. We took a different approach. We stuck with strength principles and used leverage to our advantage so that we would do tuck planche push-ups. They're just not as pretty. And so what happens is when Richard does his tuck planche push-ups, his hips would sag a little bit. But the intention wasn't to let his hips sag. It was he was fighting to keep them up. Every second of the exercise was very difficult for him. And little by little, naturally his hips would get a bit higher because his body was adapting to that level of stress. Until one day, he was able to lift up and down with his hips in line with his shoulders, which would technically be good form. The reason I say good form in quotations, it's because it's very arbitrary, just like perfectionism. If you subscribe to that idea, you're basically saying that any other way from what you've learned is wrong, and you're refusing to accept that a different way from what you've learned could help someone who's different from you. For myself and the people I work with, I really only look at 2 standards to qualify something as good form. The first one would be safety. We want to be as safe as possible to minimize injury. For example, in a deadlift, we want to avoid rounding our back because there's a lot of compressive force on the spine. So we want to keep a neutral spine to minimize pain and injuries. The second standard is strength. We're trying to find the most effective ways to oppose gravity because in calisthenics, that's how we become stronger. So if we take a look at the planche, for example, in the planche, what gravity wants to do is that it wants to bend our elbows and arch our back. So we want to do the opposite to oppose gravity so we can get stronger. So we're going to straighten out our elbows and round our upper back. For the most part, everything outside of those two standards really doesn't matter. And I know someone's going to mention how I did something incorrectly because it was done differently from how they were taught. But whoever says that doesn't really understand leverage. For example, in the planche, in the straddle planche example that I showed in the first clip of the video, my knees were slightly bent. That's not a bad thing. That just means they weren't totally straight and they weren't totally bent. It was right in between, so that means it was a little bit easier than fully straight and a little bit harder than fully bent. If that was the intensity level that I was working at, that's helping me accomplish my goals and helping me get a little bit stronger over time. So my suggestion there is just keep it simple. If you're performing it safely and you're able to add a bit more difficulty level to your exercises week by week, you're doing intensity right. And I get questions and comments about this all the time. And I usually respond the same way. I ask them what's good form to them. And I also reply with my definition of good form, which would be adding progressive overload gradually under safe load. And if we can keep those two standards of safety and strength, then we're able to apply this intensity in a safe and effective way. And I think this really sparks a very interesting conversation, which was the motivation behind this video. So if you guys have questions about that, or if you have a different definition of good form, I'd love to hear it. So please leave it in the comments. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this topic. And if you like the video, please hit the like button and subscribe if you want to watch more videos like this one. Until next time.